Hi guys, Brett Manning here, Trustee of the new Aussie Constitution Trust. The new Aussie Constitution is a proposed draft replacement for the Australian Constitution. Today I just want to talk about one aspect of the new Aussie Constitution. But one of the key issues is having an Australian head of state that's elected by the people. Currently Her Majesty the Queen is the Australian head of state. Now I'm actually quite comfortable with Her Majesty in that role as head of state for Australia, because she has demonstrated that she won't interfere in Australian politics and in the running of the Australian government. But there is no certainty that a future monarch will behave in the same way. And this makes the current constitution a problem, because the current constitution ultimately gives the power to the monarch. So if Prince Charles was to become monarch, become King Charles at some point in the future, would he behave the same? The question here is, can King Charles influence the decision of a democratically elected Australian government? Can King Charles impose his will on Australia and Australians and how they operate? And the Constitution says that the country is run by the Governor-General with the advice of ministers that the Governor-General has chosen. And the Governor-General, there's nothing in there that says the Governor-General can go against the requirements of the monarch to whom they have sworn allegiance. So the only way to change that from happening to Australia under those circumstances is to have the Australian people vote on a new constitution. Can you imagine the pandemonium? Try and draft the constitution as quickly as possible, get it passed by the Australian citizens, a majority of all Australians plus a majority of Australians in a majority of states have to pass that constitution. What I'm suggesting with the new Aussie Constitution is that we start working on a replacement constitution now, so we don't find ourselves in that situation where there is a constitutional crisis. Now maybe it wouldn't be as extreme as all that, but perhaps it's a case of King Charles ringing up the Prime Minister of Australia and expressing his deeply held views on what the Australian government should do, which may or may not be appropriate for Australia. And it may or may not be what the government of the day was elected to do. Even if this influence is mild, in fact, if it's mild and in private, as most discussions between the Australian Prime Minister and the Sovereign would be, we may not even be aware of it. There could be influence brought to bear on the Australian government that the Australian people are never ever aware of. And our Constitution will support that. Technically, the monarch could also reserve legislation for the monarch's own review and approval. And he could then sit on that legislation for an extended period of time and put a lot of pressure on the Australian government, which is unable to get its legislative agenda through. All of that would be within the capacity of the current constitution. And you say, oh, well, that'd be a bit far-fetched. But interestingly, if you have a look at the Australia Act, which I think was brought in 1986 to separate the UK Parliament from the Australian Parliament and decisions, there are 3 clauses in there, 7, 8 and 9, in respect of the state governments that specifically require the state governors to approve legislation or give assent to a legislation that's been approved by the state parliaments. So somebody decided it was important enough to ensure that the monarch didn't interfere in the passage of state legislation where they had the opportunity to do that. Okay? It also limits the powers of the monarch in respect of state legislation. But these three clauses, 7, 8 and 9 in the Australia Act, clearly saw that there was a risk of a future monarch acting against state interests and state legislation. We've got exactly the same problem at the Commonwealth level, but the only way we can fix that is to replace the Constitution. And we need an Australian head of state, and that head of state needs to be elected by the Australian people. And the new Aussie Constitution promotes that approach. Under the new Aussie Constitution, the Governor-General would become the Australian head of state. At the end of the day, the monarch can decide how Australia is run and operated. We need to change that constitution to one that provides us with full independence. But just recently, Barbados changed their constitution and removed the monarch from their system of government. Barbados can do it. Australia can't. Interestingly, it was the Barbados Parliament that determined the new constitution. In Australia, we would have to vote on the new constitution. The people would determine. And my problem with politicians deciding a new constitution is that politicians are going to look after the systems that had them elected. They're going to look after the systems that they are familiar with. They are going to structure the whole thing in a way that benefits them and their continued service. The proposed draft new Aussie Constitution has been developed outside of government, outside of political parties. It's been independently developed. I recognise that the politicians are our representatives, the people's representatives in the Parliament. Okay, but they also have a major conflict of interest in the development of a new constitution. So we need input from our politicians. But at the end of the day, the Australian people need to decide, and drafting it outside of those circles gives us the best chance of addressing some of the issues with the Australian Constitution. I think it's important now, under Queen Elizabeth's reign, while everything is stable, that we have this conversation about replacing the Australian Constitution. We can put it to referendum on the basis that it comes into force when there's a change of monarch in the future. We need to care about this issue before it comes back to bite us. Thanks for your time.